Do you want to get into the really difficult part of Final Fantasy XIV? The newest extremes, the current Unreal, the current endgame Savage Raid tier? Ultimates? But maybe you aren't sure where to begin. In that case, you have come to the right place. This guide will go over every single step of the way into starting Savage Raiding. The first question is whether you plan to raid with a static, a fixed raid team, or you plan to use the Partyfinder. If you intend to use the Partyfinder, that is a very easy first step right now, but if you plan to raid with a static, this might be the hardest step of them all. There are many ways to find a static, and optimally you'd want the 7 other team members to be about as motivated for raiding as you are. Not to mention that preferably you should like the group too. Now, rather than claim that it is easy to find the right static for you, it's not. I will instead offer a few places you can try to look. Sometimes statics advertise spots in Partyfinder. The Fellowship Finder and the Community Finder can also sometimes be used to find a static in a similar fashion. Making clever use of search terms can help with the search. For tools outside of the game, some data centers have Discord servers specifically dedicated to finding others to raid with, but even asking where to look in other general Final Fantasy XIV-centric Discord servers can often be helpful to find a place to look. This, of course, only covers a few ways to find a static. However, maybe if you have a suggestion for how to find a static yourself, maybe sharing it in the comments can help others find one too. With your decision about statics or Partyfinder out of the way, your next step is to figure out what role and job you want to play. In a static, this might already be dictated at least partly by what seats are already taken, or an agreement with the group. In Partyfinder, however, the key things to consider are 1. What jobs do you enjoy playing? 2. Which of them do you feel comfortable playing in difficult content? And 3. Are you willing to wait longer for groups to play a particularly popular job, or would you be willing to play something you like a bit less for the sake of having an easier time finding groups? For the first 2 questions, this is mainly up to you as an individual. Obviously, the best job to progress Savage content with is the one you like the most, as otherwise you might lose interest because you're playing something you don't even want to play in the first place. However, understandably, some players might love playing Black Mage, but also accept the fact that they simply don't feel comfortable playing the job in a situation where you really need to do mechanics almost perfectly, while also keeping up the damage. Maybe your secondary pick is Summoner or Red Mage, or maybe it's an entirely different role, but the question is whether you are willing to risk it with Black Mage, or would rather play it safe and choose a job you feel more comfortable with. If you have no preference, I have a guide that recommends a somewhat straightforward job in each role, which might help with that decision. For the third point, groups tend to want 8 unique jobs in each party, as having duplicates makes the limit break charge slower. And not having a specific role represented at all results in less bonus from the party bonus. As such, you can assume that more popular jobs in a role are more likely to already be in Partyfinder groups. For the most part, there are 4 DPS slots, and the 4th one could be any type of DPS, which means that, for example, if you were to main Summoner, the by far most popular Mage DPS, there is a much greater chance that there already is a Summoner in any group you join compared to Red Mage or Black Mage. The same applies to Dancer and Samurai for the ranged DPS and melee DPS slots. Warriors and White Mages are similarly overwhelmingly popular in their respective roles. Regardless, once you have weighed these 3 points, your preference, your comfort, and how long you're willing to look for groups, you can choose your Savage raiding job. In fact, you might even choose to play multiple jobs in a row. Regardless of whether the job you chose is one you feel very well acquainted with or not, it may be helpful to read or watch a guide on the job on how to play it at max level to be sure there's nothing you have greatly misunderstood or forgotten about. While learning or mastering an opener might help you get a general understanding of how to start a fight on the job, this part of starting Savage is not crucially important. Try to get somewhat comfortable with using your tools efficiently at the start of a fight to get going, but doing the perfect opener and rotation is not required. This will come with experience later. The next step is preparing your equipment. Look into what stats your job prefers. In most cases, it's probably something to do with crit, but after that, many jobs have some small detail preferences, like specific speed amounts or slight preference towards direct hit or determination. and while the difference is minuscule, if you are going to pay for materia and equipment, might as well get the best one, right? If you are aiming to Savage Raid specifically, then looking into best in slot lists might be helpful as well, such that you invest your weekly tomestones in the pieces that won't be replaced first. If you are not planning to Savage Raid, just Extremes for instance, then it is more important to just look at exactly what stats are on the gear pieces you have available to choose from. Get the best weekly tomestone pieces for your job, then you can make use of normal raid pieces and high quality crafted pieces for the rest. Optimally in this raid tier, you should want all of your gear pieces to be at least item level 640. Notably, the only easily accessible weapons are crafted. After that, you meld according to your stat priority. While best in slot lists may have very specific melding specifications, these are designed to hit super specific stat breakpoints, among other things, which only apply consistently if you are wearing the exact same pieces. So, as long as you don't have the full set, following your stat priority is more reliable. If you have crafted gear pieces and the money to afford it, you can also overmeld for some extra stats. However, this is not a requirement. Next, look into your consumables. First up is food buffs. In each raid tier, there are typically nearly a dozen different meal options to choose from that are up to date. The item levels should be the same as the crafted gear of the tier. If you aren't sure what options you have, check the meals category on the market board. However, usually, only a few of the food options are used by any job at all when optimizing. For instance, in the current raid tier, the popular options are baked eggplant, caviar canapes, and caviar sandwich, depending on your preferences. Nearly all jobs will use either baked eggplant or caviar canapes, so simply consider what you need the most. Often, you learn this when looking up best in slot lists too. Make sure to buy a decent amount of food, as you will need somewhere between 2 and 4 to be fully covered from start to finish of a raid session. I would recommend getting around a dozen, that's 12, or 13 for the bakers in the audience. Make sure they are all high quality. You should always have a food buff, even when learning a fight, as the vitality it grants might just be the difference between life and death sometimes. After that, consider your burst potions. Granted, while you are learning a fight, you don't need to throw in tinctures to burst only to wipe at 80% anyway. But carrying some tinctures so you're ready in case the group you're going with somehow reaches enrage is not a bad idea. Simply put, buy some of the newest tinctures that matches the attribute your job needs to deal more damage. No, tanks should not get vitality tinctures. I'm not sure why they are in the game. Additionally, healers might consider grabbing some of the biggest ethers they can get as well. Note that ethers and tinctures share cooldown, so you don't get to use both. Typically, you won't need an ether during the first few minutes of a fight, but you might need one later down the line if your group required a lot of spell healing or raises. It is a good backup to continue a bit further while learning, and going out of MP would be the saddest reason to wipe. Once again, make sure that both your tinctures and your ethers are high quality, as it both affects the potency of them, but even the cooldown is shorter on a high quality variant. And now, you have your job of choice. You have your food, whether it's a delicious eggplant or caviar. You have your tinctures ready to go if you need them, and now, let's actually look at the fight you're going to be doing. How do you go about preparing yourself for an extreme, savage or ultimate boss fight? Well, if you intend to go in blind, then you just do nothing. However, unless your entire party is aware that you are going in blind, they might be too. It would be rude to enter a group blind without explicitly stating it, as otherwise it's like showing up to a group project and having done nothing on your end. In any other case, the best way to start is to either read or watch a guide of the fight. I don't personally make Savage Raid boss guides, so I don't have a bias here, but even so, I will not recommend a specific guide creator. If you run with a static, it is a good idea to discuss and agree on a specific guide to read or watch so that everyone is on the same page. If you're rolling with Partyfinder, going over at least one guide is a good idea. If you have the mental space and time to check multiple guides, that might be helpful too. Some Partyfinder groups will even name drop a specific guide, and if you don't know the general idea of that particular guide, it might spell trouble to join them. If you aren't sure you know the strategy they use, but you feel confident that you can adjust, you can always join them and ask if their strategy is drastically different from the strategy you know. Giving the specific name of the creator of the guide often helps. Now, when looking over a guide for a boss fight, there can be a lot of information to take in. If you find it a bit overwhelming, focus on what your role needs to do. If you are a DPS, you probably don't need to think much about tank busters, aside from getting out of the way of them. Focus on the mechanics that you need to deal with. Usually, there will be 2 positions to consider for a mechanic for each role. Sometimes there can be more, but in most cases it refers to either, say, Tank 1 or Tank 2, Healer 1 or Healer 2, Melee 1 or Melee 2, or Ranged 1 or Ranged 2. So, if you play Ranged for instance, what really matters is just any mechanic that Ranged 1 or Ranged 2 will need to deal with that you need to understand. Focus on those. If a fight is obscenely long, like ultimates, you might be better served only really learning a certain amount of phases and mechanics and focusing on those, so you have a chance of remembering it, instead of trying to memorize the whole thing and remembering nothing. Once again, in a static situation, communicating with your team about this might be great. Now you have somewhat of an idea of what to expect when you finally get into the raid. But how do groups actually decide on how to deal with mechanics, precisely? There are 2 especially common ways groups tend to go about distributing positions. The one I am most familiar with is the macro positions. Someone in the party, usually the leader, uses a macro to paste an ASCII-like drawing with multiple positions and labels. You simply write in the party chat and announce which spot you want. If 2 players want the same spot, then you need to figure that out too. But once everyone has their designated spots, you know your positions for all mechanics based on the macro alone. You might find it handy to copy the macro for your own storage, or at least take a screenshot of it so you can check it throughout the session if you need to. If your data center and/or region prefers this style, it might also be beneficial to look up at least one macro like this for the fight so you have an idea of what to expect before you go in. Some data centers or regions prefer to do so-called marker dances. They're also known by other names. The marker dance is a more literal presentation of the macro position style. Markers will be put down that will represent the positions needed for a specific mechanic, and each player will step into a marker to signify where they intend to stand for the mechanic. This way, everyone knows that everyone understands precisely where they are supposed to stand. That is at least the idea. Some of these positions may be somewhat implied since, for example, the main tank is almost always placed at the northernmost position, if possible. If your data center and/or region uses this style, it is a great idea to have a general understanding of where you want to be in a fight, where you would like to be, and so on, so you don't get confused if presented with this style of role distribution. And now you are ready. If you have a static, you can simply practice your job a bit, maybe do something else. Simply meet up prepared for the raid and you're good. If on the other hand you're relying on Partyfinder, this is where you need to find a group that works for you. How do you do that? Often, Partyfinder descriptions can read like hieroglyphs and be completely impossible to understand, even if you did your homework. Specific strategies or positions may have been reduced down to an abbreviation of 2 letters to fit as much information as possible. Maybe the guide you used is known by a different name than you thought. Well, the most important part to take note of is if you see a group that, for example, name drops a specific mechanic as what they are practicing or trying to go beyond. You should probably not join such a group unless you are confident in your ability to do all of the mechanics leading up to it. Considering groups with compositions that you fit in may also be beneficial. For example, if you're trying to join as a summoner, it might not be entirely optimal if the group already has 2 mages. Once you have sorted all these things out, join a group. If you aren't sure if they follow a strategy you know, ask. Better that you know whether you are following the same strategy than wasting time on a misunderstanding. The worst that can happen is that you might get kicked if the leader is a bit grumpy, but that would probably have happened anyway eventually. And now that you are in your raid group, you zone into the boss fight, you are on the hardest part of it all, beating the boss. And that is where I am going to leave the rest to you. This one you have to figure out yourself. Good luck. That is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to support me and my channel, you can make sure to let the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. And if you want to give even more support than that, you can also become a member of the channel like these wonderful people here. Fun fact, technically all potions share cooldown with very few exceptions. For example, even the simple basic potion, when used, will put tinctures on cooldown. However, Echo Drops, used to remove removable silencing effects, does not share cooldown with these potions. This is mostly significant because the somewhat recently added Hyper Potion can actually heal a significant amount of HP on squishier jobs like healers and mages. Even more so in older content. But regularly using these might lock you out of a more important potion when you don't want it.